North Yorkshire, and near the town of Skipton, where I live. And Skipton features quite a lot in my book, which I'll just introduce to you now. So, Proto-UFOs, Poltergeist and Plasma-Craft, an interdisciplinary study on the phenomenology and ontology of UAP contact, subtitled A Study of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena and Things That Go Bump in the Night. The inspiration for this was actually Skipton police officer and police sergeant Tony Dodd. Wrote a book called UFO Investigator, which and it's released from studying his, follow it from his work. It inspired me to get into ufology in the first place. You'll read about that if you read the book. But what I wanted to read for you tonight is a chapter. I forget what chapter number it is, but it's a chapter called The Exo. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. Chapter 15. Before I read it, I want to read something from the foreword written by my friend David Griffin. You'll be able to read the prologue for free on the internet on Google Books and things for the foreword and the prologue. But David has been a friend for, when did I first meet David? Probably about 2009, I guess it was. So it's 17 years. So he about 10 years ago, just a little over 10 years ago, he invited me to do it on Skywatch in Tommerden, which is in West Yorkshire, south of here, on the Lancashire West Yorkshire border. And that gave me, I think I'd had a few UFO sightings prior to that, but that was kind of a turning point in my revelation for my understanding of the phenomenon from research I've been doing. So I asked him if he would write the foreword to the book, which he did, and I just want to read something from that, which he wrote about the actual chapter I'm going to read to you. So David Griffin writes in the foreword, what Anthony rightly focuses on predominantly today is less a probing physical ET representation and more one of a holographic type merging of what the 1990s postmodernists termed the other with human awareness or consciousness itself. As part of the book's novel and meta themes, it's the exo, great condensed concept there, Ants, that's employed as an often required vehicle for these other or language-resistant liminal spaces. Like it or not, we urgently need to invent and embrace a new language framework in order to decipher the 70 years of intermeshed alien, human and state-distorted phenomena. Whether it's the much-hyped Pentagon disclosure, media-friendly releases, or the quieter data stream of contactee narratives, it's the way we present these events to ourselves linguistically that ultimately nudges the outcome. So that's an excerpt from the foreword by David Griffin. And so he's referencing the chapter The Exo, which I'll read some for you now. So, Chapter 15, The Exo. Underpinning the human mind are the archetypes, ancient patterns to which the mind in its unconscious form seems to abide, influencing in turn the patterns of our behaviours, thoughts and desires, indeed all our psychic expressions. In the chapter Catalytic Exteriorization Phenomenon, where I introduced the concept of that name, I quoted Carl Jung, who, while discussing one such poltergeist-like event, described a manifestation of his mother's personality as her, quote, number 2 voice. My mother nodded darkly. Yes, yes, she said in her number 2 voice. That means something. In his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung gives us an autobiographical account of his youth, where he indeed saw 2 sides to his mother's personality, and he learned to identify a similar pattern in his own mind. His mother's number 2 was a rational, analytical personality, embodying keenly masculine traits, whereas his mother's number 1 personality was empathic, irrational and keenly feminine. The female element of the male unconscious and the male element of the female unconscious Jung would later consider are fundamental archetypes in the human psyche. Traits of the opposite gender to that of the human being's biological gender are held in the personal unconscious along with suppressed traits in what Jung called the shadow. In the personal unconscious of a male resides the suppressed traits of the female and vice versa. When expressing what Jung called his mother's number 2 voice, she was, in Jung's view, expressing the keenly male traits from the unconscious. These contrasexual aspects of the unconscious he called the anima, feminine in males, and the animus, masculine in females. Takeover or expression of this archetype in the psyche is known as anima possession, the number 2 of C.G. Jung, and animus possession, the number 2 of Jung's mother. Analogous to the role of the executive officer or the XO in naval parlance, the number 2 can be likened to the second in command within a vessel's personnel hierarchy. It can assume control of the ship when the consciousness of the primary personality temporarily disengages from the bridge. Like all the archetypes, the anima is a template or pattern that cannot itself be expressed without it being given state with which to exist. Instantiation of the anima in the unconscious is described by Jung as the soul. Quoting Jung, "The anima is not the soul in the dogmatic sense, not an anima rationalis, which is a philosophical conception, but a natural archetype that satisfactorily sums up all its statements of the unconscious, of the primitive mind, of the history of language and religion. It is a factor in the proper sense of the word. Man cannot make it. On the contrary, it is always the a priori element in his moods, reactions, impulses, and whatever else is spontaneous in psychic life. It is something that lives of itself, that makes us live. It is a life behind consciousness that cannot be completely integrated with it, but from which, on the contrary, consciousness arises." Within the UFO experience, a phenomenon known as close encounters of the fourth kind, UFO abductions, we find this pattern of gender opposites. We find the anima expressed in the narratives of those who experience UFO abduction as a familiar entity, alien in form and alien in gender, from that of the human experiencer. This is often seen as a guardian aboard the spaceship, with whom the human experiencer feels a close attachment that is often at odds with the immediate emotion of outright terror. Quote, "Sitting before me was the most astonishing being I have ever seen in my life, made the more astonishing by the fact that I knew her. I say her, but I don't know why. To me this is a woman, perhaps because her movements are so graceful, perhaps because she has created states of sexual arousal in me, or perhaps it is simply the memory of her hand touching the side of my chest one time, so lightly and yet with such firmness. She was undeniably appealing to me. In some sense I thought I might love this being, almost as much as I might my own anima. I bore towards her the same feelings of terror and fascination that I might towards someone I saw staring back at me from the depths of my unconscious." In these two passages, Whitley Strieber acknowledges the similarity the anima relationship has with his own experience. However, he seems to use it only metaphorically. Perhaps he tentatively considered it as more than a metaphor. If so, he wrote no more about it in his book Communion. This pattern of gender-opposite familiar entities appearing in UFO abductions do, however, appear to be first documented by Strieber in that same book. This came from his contact with a close-knit group of experiencers with whom he met and corresponded. Brought together by researcher Bob Hopkins, it was initially through hearing experiencer testimony within these group sessions and his subsequent meetings with other UFO abduction experiencers that led Strieber to notice this gender-opposite pattern in UFO abduction accounts. Yet this pattern is not limited to cases within UFO lore. In some instances, spiritualist mediums speak, so it is claimed, through a child control, sometimes called a spirit control, usually considered to be a disincarnate entity. The child control or spirit control is often seen as the gender opposite of the person acting as the medium. Medium Rudy Schneider was studied extensively by British and European researchers in psychokinesis experiments, with Jung participating in some of these to obtain personal experience with alleged physical phenomena. In one such experiment, the researchers challenged Schneider to block the transmission of infrared light using only his mind, whereby his spirit control, an entity calling herself Olga, would say, "I am going into the light," at the moment when the infrared beams were interrupted, all the while Schneider was in a trance. In the case of Helene Priest's Carl Jung's cousin and the subject of his doctoral thesis, she had two primary controls. Initially the spirit, claimed to be her grandfather, and then later an infantile personality calling himself Ulrich von Gerbenstein, who would dominate later seances. Additionally, that a child control speaks through the medium is suggested by Nando Fodor to be a possible example of infantile regression from within the psyche. This infantile nature of entities we have seen in an earlier chapter, where the poltergeist, calling itself the witch, would deliver a shocking vitriolic diatribe that eclipsed to a degree its childish, immature and distinctly human nature. In the UFO literature we find the classic case of Betty Andreasson and her family, who had no one to turn to after their bizarre and terrifying encounters with aliens, until US Air Force Project Blue Book consultant and astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek of the Center of UFO Studies published a request for data on close encounters of the fourth kind. It was the evening of January 25th, 1967. In the house, Betty's children watched television with their grandmother while Betty worked in the kitchen. Suddenly, the electric lights began to flicker hesitantly and then blink out, throwing the house into darkness and confusion. Then, from a small kitchen window, a pinkish light began to glow. From hypnosis sessions with witnesses, we learned from Betty. Suddenly the lights were off and we wondered, what was that? What was it? And we looked out. There was, by the windows, a small kitchen window. I can see like a light. It's sort of pinkish right now. Now the light is getting brighter. It's a reddish orange and it's pulsating. I said to the children, "Be quiet and quick, get into the living room and whatever it is will go away." It seemed like the whole house had a vacuum over it, like stillness all around. Betty's daughter, Becky, recalled, "The next thing I knew, Mum was going, 'Shh, be quiet. There's some huge pulsating glow that's out in the kitchen.'" Betty's father, Wayno Aho, hurried into the kitchen to see what was going on, and glancing into the backyard through the pantry window, he stared out in disbelief. "These creatures that I saw through the window of Betty's house were just like Halloween freaks. I thought they had put on a funny kind of headdress imitating a moon man. It was funny the way they jumped, one after the other, just like grasshoppers. When they saw me looking at them, they stopped. The one in the front looked at me, and I felt kind of queer. That's all I knew." Afterwards, Betty was unable to recall much more than electrical outages and an unusual pink light, and she'd been troubled by the thought of that something more had occurred, and sought help. After learning about Hynek's request for CE4 data, she responded, and a few months later Hynek sent local investigator Raymond Fowler to visit with Betty and her family. Hynek would later write the foreword to Fowler's book on the case, and in the detailed narrative that Fowler provides, we find that Betty's primary alien contact is an entity which is a gender opposite her Animus in character. Additionally, this testimony goes on to show that the beings appear to have characteristics of the dead, as described by Jung. In her first recollected encounter in the kitchen of their family home, the alien beings informed Betty that they required nourishment, and, after some confusion where Betty began to cook a meal, they clarified to her that they feed on knowledge. As we will see, rather than extraterrestrials per se, they do appear to be more like the ancestors as described by Jung, always being in need of learning from the living. Perhaps there is a process of constructivism at work where those who experience a UFO abduction inform the manifestation of its extraterrestrial origins rather than letting the contact speak for itself. Adding to the problems we face when analysing this case is the fact that it centres almost entirely around the regression hypnosis session data. From Raymond Fowler's book, The Andreasson Affair, it is unclear what amount of conscious recall of unusual and profound experiences Betty and her family had prior to their hypnosis sessions, beyond the sighting of an unusual pink light shining through the kitchen window and electrical power cuts. Similarly, while Whitley Strieber's claim to conscious recall is much greater, certain aspects of his narrative, such as the nature of the relationship he had with his primary alien being, that we can associate with his Anima, may perhaps also be brought into question. It has been argued that when researchers carry out hypnosis as an intelligence gathering tool, confabulation of the original memory does occur, and the extent to which this renders even a fraction of the narrative as erroneous is simply unknowable. Dr. Martin Orn, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania and former President of the International Society of Hypnosis, in a 1979 paper on the use and misuse of hypnosis in court, warns us that there is no way, however, by which anyone, even a psychologist or psychiatrist with extensive training in the field of hypnosis, can, for any particular piece of information, determine whether it is actual memory versus a confabulation unless there is independent verification. Within the field of UFO research, the nature of that independent verification of regression hypnosis data appears to be, at times, no more thorough than asserting that a UFO had been sighted during the incident. It has been argued by ufology's arch-debunker, physicist Philip J. Klass, that ignoring Professor Orn's warnings on the limitation of the use of hypnosis has created what amounts to a new religion, created out of the misuse of hypnosis as an intelligence-gathering tool. To Klass, the aliens were created by the mind in a natural process that attempts to fill in the blanks in the experiences consciously recalled the narrative. Can we prove Klass wrong? With regression hypnosis data alone, I think he may have won the argument. However, regression hypnosis data is far from all the entity contact data we have. That said, could this Animus phenomenon, the gender opposite familiars within ET contact narratives, simply be an artifact of regression hypnosis corrupting real original memories? Do any accounts exist where an experiencer has actual recall of ETs that fit with this model of their primary ET familiar being their Anima or Animus? Notable examples that help refute this argument that this is merely an artifact of regression hypnosis are the Lady of Hao Manga, the Lady of Chris Bledsoe, and the Lady of Stan Romanek, to name just a few. I'll just read a footnote here because I think it's important. Jung observes that theologians historically viewed the soul as feminine, though it's worth noting that these theologians were almost exclusively men. I think this pattern is unlikely to be an artifact of regression hypnosis, given that the pattern of these unconscious archetypes also shows up in spiritualism with mediums as spirit controls and child controls. It's an artifact of communication between the conscious and the unconscious mind, and its presence in CE4 data indicates to us that entity contact with within CE4 scenarios occurs, at some level at least, through contact with the unconscious. Like many ufologists, former police detective and police sergeant Tony Dodd soon discovered connections with poltergeist activity once his UFO investigations led him to claims of UFO abduction. This is quoting Dodd, one of the most striking aspects of repeated abduction cases is that they are so often surrounded by bursts of other paranormal activity, the sort of events that are normally put down to poltergeists. Things go missing and then turn up again. Electricity surges and cuts out. There are strange noises like footsteps and water running. Often there are peculiar smells, sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant. Abductees sometimes feel they develop enhanced psychic abilities, being able to foresee events. One of the cases Dodd investigated was that of Anne Andrews and her family from Kent, England. Anne and her son Jason, both UFO abductees, did not undergo hypnosis in order to reveal what happened to them. Both would recall their abduction episode spontaneously. Jason would often remember the events next morning, whereas his mother Anne would more typically recall the events through flashbacks. While Anne and Jason would report the UFO abduction scenario, the whole family, including son Daniel and husband Paul, would witness poltergeist phenomena and also Jason's episodes of unusual somnambulistic states. In these states, unusual utterances would manifest from Jason while he was seemingly in a trance. But later in life, Jung considered that the voices of the unconscious to be indistinguishable from spirits of the dead, human ancestors who seek knowledge from their living descendants, acting also at times as spirit guides. When considering the poltergeist and disincarnate voice phenomena that preceded and perhaps even enabled his writing of Septum Sermons, he reflected that shortly before this experience I had written down a fantasy of my soul having flown away with me. This was a significant event. The soul, the anima, establishes the relationship to the unconscious. In a certain sense, this is also the relationship to the collectivity of the dead, for the unconscious corresponds to the mythic land of the dead, the land of the ancestors. If, therefore, one has a fantasy of the soul vanishing, this means that it has withdrawn into the unconscious or into the land of the dead. There it produces a mysterious animation and gives visible form to the ancestral traces, the collective contents. Like a medium, it gives the dead a chance to manifest themselves. Therefore, soon after the disappearance of my soul, the dead appeared to me, and the result was the Septum Sermons. This is an example of what is called loss of soul, a phenomenon encountered quite frequently among primitives. There's a bit more of an extensive writing about the background to that in an earlier chapter. The late Monsignor Corrado Balducci, a Catholic prelate and senior exorcist and demonologist for the Vatican, was outspoken about his beliefs that extraterrestrial intelligences are interacting with humanity. In 2005, I attended a speech he gave near Washington, D.C., where he discussed his personal research into the UFO phenomenon. Explaining what he had learned through his study of research from the mid-19th to the early 20th century, he noted that researchers of that period, such as the Society for Psychical Research, who studied phenomena that today would call UFO abductions, had reasoned that the entities involved with the phenomenon, whatever they were not demons. However, the possibility that they may have been the souls of the dead remained. UFO researcher Jacques Vallée also noted that entities seen within CE4 narratives indicate that they are seekers of knowledge. Betty Andreasson was called this explicitly during her kitchen encounter by the entity calling itself Quascar, who it could be argued was her Animus. This corresponds to Jung's explanation of the nature of the relationship between the dead and the living. This is quoting Jung. According to the traditional views, the dead are the possessors of great knowledge. People have the idea that the dead know far more than we, for Christian doctrine teaches that in the hereafter we shall see face to face. Apparently, however, the souls of the dead know only what they knew at the moment of death and nothing beyond that. Hence their endeavour to penetrate into life in order to share into the knowledge of men. It seems to me as if they were dependent on the living for receiving answers to their questions, that is, on those who have survived them and exist in a world of change, as if omniscience, or as I might put it, omniconsciousness, were not at their disposal, but could flow only into the psyche of the living, into a soul bound to a body. The mind of the living appears, therefore, to hold an advantage over that of the dead, in at least one point, in the capacity for attaining clear and decisive cognitions. As I see it, the three-dimensional world in time and space is like a system of coordinates. What is here, separated into ordinates and abscissae, may appear there in a space-timelessness as a primordial image with many aspects, perhaps as a diffuse cloud of cognition surrounding an archetype. Yet a system of coordinates is necessary if any distinction of concrete contents is to be possible. End quote. So I have thought that contact with extraterrestrials, if it is really occurring, might operate through a process of non-local consciousness, a cosmic consciousness, where physical sentient beings such as ourselves can share in the consciousness as a non-local fundamental property of the natural world. It seems to me that this is the realm of the collective unconscious described by Jung, and indeed, the appearance of these archetypes of the collective unconscious and as traits of UFO abductions and other ET contact narratives supports this idea. Jung saw in the collective unconscious a place that bore the relationship between the living and their ancestors. He saw this as a kind of abstract, uninstantiated fundamental structure of mind beyond space-time. This is perhaps the realm in which contact with others, or the visitors of ufology, takes place. The others may be extraterrestrials, they may be the souls of the dead, there may be something else entirely, or all of the above, but either way, can there really be any distinction between them? Mike Cleland recognises too that the place where experiences are had is not necessarily in the physical space where we normally live our lives. Perhaps these experiences really do occur in our inner phenomenal worlds, rather than in the space of our outer phenomenal world. Quoting Mike Cleland here. Abductees will constantly describe their experience as dreamlike, yet they'll also say they are extremely vivid. People are having real experiences, I'm convinced of that, but it seems that the contact itself takes place beyond our surface world, as if their consciousness gets transported to some deeper realm and then returned. Yet we are certainly now very much aware that an aspect of the overall phenomenon does indeed take place in an outer phenomenal world, in the real physical space around us. Unidentified aerial phenomena are perhaps part of that bleed over between our notion of the self and the flight of the soul, the anima, on its sojourn to commune with the realm of the dead and perhaps with extraterrestrial beings or some representation of them. Of course, the context of communion in a non-local space beyond space-time would render the terms extraterrestrial and terrestrial meaningless, yet if we are accessing such a meeting place, so too might any number of other sentient entities, the denizens of anywhere we might possibly conceive of. The United States Air Force's recent claims to have shot down UAP, despite admittedly, so they claim, not knowing what they actually shot at, was easy prey for the cruel stand-up comic class. Comedians reflected on the insanity of the situation, where the acknowledgement that UFOs were actually real was less interesting and indeed less significant than the fact that they had shot one down while simultaneously entertaining the idea that it may have been a piloted craft of extraterrestrial origin. Infusion of humour onto this potentially terrifying prospect may have diffused the anxiety a little, yet in the context of what UAP might actually represent, it's almost as if our collective consciousness of our species is declaring war against its collective unconscious, the epitome of a psychic neurosis. Strieber's anecdotal observation that ET familiars are often gender opposite is intriguing, but no doubt requires firmer confirmation. After learning of this, I began to see it throughout the contactee and experiencer literature myself. And in order to avoid my bias as much as possible, I decided to review the case studies documented by John Mack, Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, in his seminal book Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. This methodology of selecting a single book is not perfect either, as Mack will have had to choose from cases to present in his book for the specific purpose of revealing his own unfolding narrative. In his book, early cases are overtly more straightforward, whereas later cases he shows an increasing complexity as he introduces deeper concepts in his analysis of the phenomenon. Within Mack's abduction, we find that, of the 13 cases he documents, 12 can be found to have the gender of the familiar ET identified. Of these, 10 are gender opposite, concordant with our Animus ET familiar hypothesis. It is statistically insignificant at the 95% confidence level with a p-value of 0.035. Interestingly, the two discordant cases come later in the book, and Mack begins to highlight cases of experiencers who feel they have a dual nature, being part human and part ET in origin. In a lecture given by Natasha Asimovic on the hybrid consciousness in the ET encounter narrative, she discussed one of these discordant cases, that of Joe, abduction, chapter 8. Focusing on an interpretation of post-colonial theory within contactee narratives, Asimovich recognises that this dual nature of some experiences is an extension of how the psyche handles the dual nature more generally, such as with those of dual heritage and nationality. People raised in one culture while retaining a connection with a different culture seem to have a lot in common with the hybrid consciousness expressed in the ET contact narrative, as Asimovich describes it. What is intriguing here is that the two discordant cases on this Animus ET familiar hypothesis fall strongly into this category. Perhaps this can account for more than the two discordant cases found in abduction. Further study would be necessary to determine this. Mack himself suggests that the alien side of the ET-human duality felt by some UFO abduction experiences is perhaps the soul. Quoting Mack, "The alien self is sometimes perceived as a lost or abandoned soul of the human self, linked once to a common source. The felt task then becomes one of integrating the split-off self or soul and becoming whole once again." From Mack's book, the case is concordant with the Animus being the ET familiar hypothesis amounts to 83% of the cases. The strong dual nature of the experience, as discussed by Asimovich, is apparent in the remaining 17% of the cases. I should note that my certainty to have correctly identified ET familiar gender is subjective, and in two cases, including that of Joe, I have lower confidence in my interpretation than I have in other cases. However, that a pattern exists is clear, and a binomial test for significance on this small dataset shows it to be so. So it would seem that at the core of the UFO abduction experience is the journey, not of the physical human body, but of the soul, often the anima or animus described by Jung. But for some it's perhaps that the relationship between the anima and the self is operating in a different way, as alluded to by Mack. And we'll leave it there. So, yes, hope you enjoyed that, and hope you found it interesting. And I hope to do more of these videos. So stay tuned. Yep, 10 o'clock at night. It's still light, it's brilliant. Love it up here.